My name is Eleanor Vance, and at 53, I'd learned to keep my voice steady, even when everything else was falling apart. Years of managing code that powered satellites and encrypted defense links had taught me that panic never solved anything, it just made the noise louder. But when the Zoom chime rang that Friday afternoon, something inside me stilled in a way I hadn't felt before. Jason Lawton appeared on my screen, all confidence and curated charm. 33, sharp haircut, the kind of smile that seemed practiced in front of a mirror. Behind him, a whiteboard filled with buzzwords: disruption, velocity, transformation. "Eleanor," he began, leaning close to the camera. "Your contributions have been invaluable, but the company's shifting direction. We need to modernize. The architecture you maintain, well, it's legacy junk." He said it like he was naming a species of extinct animal. Then he thanked me for my dedication, mentioned transition resources, and before I could open my mouth, the call ended. The screen went black. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of my refrigerator and the faint city traffic outside my apartment window. My reflection hovered on the monitor gray hair, tired eyes, the faint shine of shock. Bills waited on the counter. My daughter Clara's tuition payment was due next week. Health insurance through Cobra would eat nearly everything left in my checking account. I pressed my palms together, the way I did before a system deploy, and tried to breathe past the sting in my chest. They'd replaced experience with optimism and called it innovation. I reached for my old file box, the one labeled Aurelius Personal. Inside, under outdated security clearance forms and dusty onboarding paperwork, I found the thin folder I'd almost forgotten. Employment Agreement 2005. Clause 9B. I remembered the man who insisted it be there, a mentor who'd said, "Someday, this might save you more than you know." My hand steadied as I unfolded the page. The words were still there, clear as code that had never failed to compile. I first walked into Aurelius Dynamics in the fall of 2005 when the company still fit inside a single converted warehouse by the Seattle docks. The walls smelled of solder and burnt coffee. There were only 16 of us then, engineers, veterans, and dreamers who believed software could hold the sky together. I remember those first weeks building encryption modules that could survive power loss mid-transmission, running test loops until dawn because a single dropped packet could mean a destroyer losing contact in open waters. We didn't call it innovation back then. We called it getting it right. Sometimes, during the graveyard shifts, I'd hear the cranes outside and imagine the ocean swallowing the signals I was trying to protect. I was younger, hungrier, and terrified of failure. I kept a note taped to my monitor. One mistake can cost lives. It wasn't corporate branding, it was truth. Years passed, and the startup became a government contractor with contracts too large to fit on a whiteboard. My code aged with the company, each line written to survive scrutiny and time. The systems I built weren't pretty. They weren't fast, but they worked every audit, every stress test, every classified review. Last year, when the Defense Department performed a surprise penetration test, they sent the results straight to me. 0 vulnerabilities, the kind of report that doesn't make headlines but keeps jobs alive. Jason's new innovation lab hasn't reached that standard once. I've seen their commits synthetic shortcuts that break under load, API patches written for presentation slides, not for reality. The board calls them agile experiments. I call them accidents waiting for signatures. I closed my laptop that night and looked at the skyline outside my apartment window. The city glittered, fast and bright, like everything Jason stood for temporary brilliance. No foundation. Down below, the ferries moved slow across the bay, steady and deliberate. That was my kind of progress, the kind that carried weight, even when no one clapped for it. The next morning, the city was gray and wet, the kind of Seattle rain that blurred everything except what mattered. I brewed the last of my coffee and sat down at the dining table, surrounded by the ghosts of my career old drives, backup disks, faded notebooks. Somewhere in that pile was my original contract from 2005. I plugged in a portable drive labeled Archive Old Sys, the kind of relic Jason's team would mock. The folders opened like layers of sediment, early blueprints, compliance letters, payroll forms. Then I saw it. Employment Agreement Vance, PDF. I hadn't looked at it since Clara was in middle school. The pages loaded slowly, as if they knew the weight they carried. My eyes traced the legal text, half expecting nothing but routine jargon. Then, midway down page 7, a familiar phrase surfaced like a whisper from another life, Clause 9b. In the event of termination without 90 days written notice, all software, designs, and systems authored solely by employee revert to employee's intellectual property, effective immediately. I leaned back, staring at the line until the words steadied. I could almost hear Colonel Whitaker's gravelly voice again. My first boss, a retired Air Force legal officer who had insisted on reviewing my contract. "You never know what kind of executive they'll bring in after I'm gone," he'd said, tapping the clause with his pen. Think of this as a parachute made of paper. Back then, I thought it was just old military paranoia. Now it felt like foresight disguised as friendship. I sat in silence, the rain ticking against the window, and read the line again. All software, designs, and systems. That was everything: the authentication frameworks, encryption kernels, even the deployment scripts the new team was still using. For 18 years, that clause had slept quietly in a forgotten document. Jason's arrogance had just woken it up. I closed the laptop gently, as if not to startle it further. Then I reached for my phone and typed a single message to the one person I trusted with words like these: Laura. I need to ask about a contract clause. Urgent. I spent the weekend in silence, the kind of silence that hums with purpose. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm outside, tapping against the windows like a metronome while I built my case line by line. First, I pulled up the company's Git repository. Years of version control stretched before me. 2903 commits signed under my name. Each one was dated, hashed, and verified through the federal compliance system. I exported every record, archived them to a secure drive, and generated cryptographic checksums for good measure. Then came the documentation encrypted architecture diagrams from 2008, testing logs from Navy audits, PDFs of protocols that carried my initials in the footer. All of it predated Jason's arrival by more than a decade. I added them to the folder labeled Evidence Root. The next folder was harder to open Slack exports. Dozens of threads where I'd warned the innovation team about the risks of using AI-assisted code generators for security systems. My words had been polite, then recommend thorough human review before implementation. They'd answered with rocket emojis and gifs of sprinting cheetahs. Now those messages were evidence. I timestamped every one of them, attached digital signatures, and mirrored the entire directory to an offline backup. By Sunday afternoon, my apartment looked less like a home and more like a command center. Coffee mugs lined the table beside drives blinking faintly under lamplight. I organized each folder the way I used to organize system dependencies: clean, labeled impossible to misinterpret. When I finally wrote to Laura Kim, the subject line was simple: Contract Clause 9b, possible activation. Her reply came 12 minutes later. If they terminated you without 90 days' notice, you own everything you built, completely. I'll draft the notice and invoice. Rest easy. Eleanor. I didn't rest, but something inside me settled. The fear that had followed me since that Zoom call began to recede, replaced by something sharper focus. I opened a new document, centered the cursor, and typed the title in bold IP reversion notice, Aurelius Dynamics. Then I saved it. Twice. The second call came almost exactly a week after the first. My phone lit up with an internal number I still recognized by heart. I let it ring twice before answering. Jason's face filled the screen, clean lighting, rehearsed calm, that same faint smile people wear when they've already made their decision. There was no HR manager beside him, no legal representative, just him. a glass wall behind his chair reflecting the skyline. "Eleanor," he began, tone clipped and careful. "After further review, we've decided to move forward without your role. Effective immediately." He paused, waiting for a reaction that didn't come. "Of course. We're deeply grateful for your contributions to Aurelius over the years." The script ended there. I kept my voice even. "Understood." For a moment, I thought I saw surprise flicker across his face. Maybe he'd expected anger, tears, something human enough to make him feel powerful. Instead, I closed my laptop, opened my email client, and attached 2 documents I'd spent all week preparing. IP reversion. Notice PDF. Invoice. 200 Bauer. Subject line termination. Without notice, Clause 9b activation. I hit send. 5 seconds later. The confirmation ping echoed through the room. That tiny sound carried 18 years of my life in it every sleepless night. Every test run, every deployment that kept soldiers connected across oceans. I sat back, breathing slowly. My hands didn't shake. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street below shimmered with the reflection of brake lights, red and wet like open circuits. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake listening to the low hum of the city, replaying Jason's words in my head, legacy junk. I thought about the systems still running on my code, about the arrogance of thinking you can replace the foundation without the builder. I whispered into the dark, quiet enough that only I could hear it. I built their backbone. Let's see them walk without it. 3 days passed before the silence broke. It started with a message from an old colleague, one I hadn't heard from since the layoffs. "You seeing the news? Check the federal portal?" I opened my laptop, half expecting rumor. Instead, every screen loaded the same error: authentication failure. Access temporarily suspended. Below it, a timestamp 2:14 a.m. and a long string of error codes I knew too well. By noon, the outage had spread through half the government's secure communication network. Jason's innovation, the streamlined authentication framework, had collapsed under its own shortcuts. The logs told the story clearly. Someone had overwritten my legacy verification layers with a machine-generated module. It worked faster until it didn't. I could picture the panic inside Aurelius Jr. engineers scrambling, leadership chain frozen. I knew how those rooms sounded, the rising hum of overlapping voices, the smell of burned coffee and fear. The company tried to contain it. Jason's team blamed legacy dependencies and told the auditors the system hadn't been fully transitioned yet. But the audit trail was unforgiving. My original code was intact up to a certain commit after that. A foreign signature appeared. Unauthorized modification. The safeguards I'd built for worst-case scenarios came alive, automatically encryption lockdowns, multi-key authentication barriers, and self-expiring admin credentials. Every portal that used my code sealed itself. By evening, the Department of Defense Compliance Office issued a notice: unauthorized IP usage under review. All access suspended pending resolution. It was the kind of phrase that made investors choke on their optimism. Jason released a statement on social media calling it a minor connectivity issue and promising a full restoration within 24 hours. The comments filled with panic within minutes, shareholders asking about contract liability, reporters quoting the suspension notice. I sat by the window as night settled over the sound, the lights of the city flickering like a console boot loop. My phone buzzed non-stop emails, missed calls, message requests from unknown numbers. I didn't answer any of them. For once, the noise wasn't mine to fix. The call came early Monday morning, quiet and direct. The name on the screen made me sit up. Margaret Han, Aurelius board chair. Her voice carried the strain of someone who hadn't slept. "Eleanor," she said, "we need to talk. If you'll consider returning, we'll make it right." No apology, just the language of business, stripped of pride. I agreed to meet that afternoon. The law office downtown smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Rain streaked the windows, softening the skyline into a gray watercolor. 3 board members sat across from me, their postures crisp but cautious. Jason wasn't there. His absence said enough. Margaret folded her hands. "We're prepared to compensate for the oversight. What would it take to restore the systems?" I placed a single folder on the table. Inside was a draft Laura had helped me finalize over the weekend. Clause 1. Aurelius Dynamics licenses, all software, designs, and systems authored by Eleanor Vance on a month-to-month basis, revocable at the sole discretion of the licensor. Clause 2. All intellectual property remains under Eleanor Vance's ownership. Clause 3. Future modifications require written approval from the licensor. No speeches, no defense. Just clean language and legal precision. They read in silence. The clock ticked once for every page they turned. When they reached the final clause, Margaret exhaled slowly, one by one. They nodded, agreed. No one said Jason's name, but by the next morning, his profile vanished from the company website. Leadership transition was the phrase of the day. We met once more to sign the new contract. The pen felt heavier than I expected, not from guilt or pride, but from the weight of closure. My signature bled neatly into the paper, every letter deliberate. Margaret extended her hand. "Welcome back." "Eleanor," I shook it, meeting her gaze. "I'm not back," I said. "You're borrowing." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. Understanding. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart over the bay. The city gleamed in fragments, and for the first time in weeks, so did I. When I walked back into the Aurelius building, it didn't feel like returning. It felt like surveying a disaster site. The glass walls and glossy banners were the same, but the air carried the kind of quiet that follows a storm. Conversations dropped when I passed. Screens froze mid-task. Someone whispered my name like it belonged to a rumor that turned out to be true. I wasn't there as an employee anymore. My badge said consultant, external authority. The title made me sound like a stranger, and maybe that was exactly what I needed to be. The engineering floor looked different. The energy that used to hum through those desks late nights, shared code reviews, sarcastic jokes had been replaced by hesitation. The young developers barely met my eyes. I could see guilt and exhaustion tangled in their expressions. They'd been told they were the future. Now they were cleaning up the remains of someone else's vision. I didn't scold them. I opened a diagram on the main screen, the authentication map Jason's team had rewritten, and began to trace its lines in silence. "See this," I said finally. "That's a redundancy loop. The system checks itself twice before sending data. Jason called it inefficiency. In defense software, we call it survival." They leaned closer. I could sense curiosity pushing past shame. I explained how the so-called legacy modules were tested under battlefield conditions, how each layer existed because of a past failure someone had already paid for. No one spoke for a while. Then a soft voice broke the silence. It was a junior engineer, barely out of college. "Why didn't you fight him sooner?" she asked. I paused, watching the code on the screen shimmer under the fluorescent light. "Because sometimes," I said, "the best way to teach someone they're wrong is to let them prove it." A few nodded. Someone began typing again, the sound of keyboards steady. Rhythmic filled the room. By evening, the diagrams looked cleaner, the team looked lighter. I hadn't planned to rebuild anything that day. But somehow, between the lines of old code and new resolve, we started to. The wire confirmation came through on a Tuesday morning, a short email from the accounting department, polite, detached, the kind that usually went unread. But this one carried a single line that changed everything. Funds transferred to 204-870-15. I stared at it for a long time before opening the banking app just to be sure. There it was, numbers lined up clean and steady, like code compiling without error. 18 years of work, erased and restored in a single transaction. Later that day, Aurelius announced the reinstatement of my protocols across all systems. The new contracts called them Heritage Stability Frameworks, a term that made me smile. What they once mocked as outdated was now a selling point in every client pitch. Even the internal memo read like a quiet confession core operations restored to verified architecture under consultant supervision. For the first time in years, I let myself slow down. I walked to the cafe across from the harbor and ordered a double espresso. No sugar. The barista didn't know who I was, and that anonymity felt like luxury. I sat by the window watching ferries drift through the fog, the rhythm of their movement steady and sure. It reminded me of the first months at Aurelius before the titles, before the noise, when precision itself was reward enough. My phone buzzed. It was Clara. "Mom." "Are you sitting down?" "I am. You're trending on LinkedIn. Everyone in my class read about your clause case. Even my professor mentioned it." I laughed, soft and tired. The kind of laugh that comes from the body more than the throat. "Guess I finally went viral." I said, "She told me she was proud, that maybe legacy wasn't such a bad word after all." When the call ended, I stayed there for a while, espresso cooling beside me, the city turning gold outside the window. Justice, it turned out, had weight, heavy in the chest, but good. By spring, the headlines had faded and the contracts had stabilized. Aurelius was quietly profitable again, though no one in the press mentioned my name anymore, and that suited me just fine. What mattered had already been settled, not in public, but in the structure of their systems, in the quiet pulse of code that still bore my signature. The invitation came from the University of Washington, a guest lecture on technology ethics and organizational memory. I almost declined. Then I thought of the young engineers back at Aurelius, the ones who had stayed late to learn, and I said yes. The auditorium smelled of whiteboard markers and burnt coffee. Rows of students waited, notebooks open, eyes bright and restless. I spoke less about law than about responsibility, how the faster we move, the easier it becomes to forget what we're building on. I told them about redundancy loops and slow reviews, about the difference between optimization and care. And when I finished, I said, "Fast isn't always progress. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is preserve what works." They applauded politely, then hurried off to their next classes, clutching laptops and half-finished coffees. I watched them go with something like hope. Maybe they'd forget my name, but not the point. Outside, the air smelled of rain and cherry blossoms. The campus buzzed with ambition, the same kind that used to keep me awake through midnight deployments. I found a bench beneath a tree and sat down, letting the noise drift past. My phone vibrated once. An email notification slid across the screen. Subject: Let's Talk Jason Lawton. I stared at it long enough to feel nothing at all. Then I swiped left and deleted it. The clouds were breaking, the light falling clean on the pavement. I opened my notebook, uncapped my pen, and wrote a new lecture title across the first page: When Competence Becomes the Quietest Form of Rebellion. The ink bled slightly into the paper, steady and unhurried, just the way I liked my code, and my piece.